My name is Miriam Santos, and I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Because sometimes, the most powerful revenge comes not from anger, but from patience. Sometimes, being invisible is the greatest superpower you could ever possess. 8 years. That's how long I'd been pushing my cleaning cart through the marble corridors of Sterling and Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious corporate law firms. 8 years of being looked through, talked over, and dismissed as if I were nothing more than a shadow that happened to clean their messes. Every morning at 5:30, I would arrive at that gleaming 40-story tower, badge myself in through the service entrance, and begin my invisible dance through their world of power suits and million-dollar deals. The executives would stride past me in their Italian leather shoes, their conversations about mergers and acquisitions flowing around me like I was a piece of furniture. "Good morning," I would say sometimes, just to test if I truly was invisible. Most days, silence. On the rare occasion someone acknowledged me, it was with a barely perceptible nod, the kind you might give to a piece of office equipment that happened to speak. But that Tuesday morning in September, everything changed. And if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed because of your age, your accent, or the color of your cleaning uniform, then you need to hear this story. Because what happened next will restore your faith that justice, even when delayed, always finds its way. I was in the service elevator, heading to the 35th floor with my cart loaded with supplies. The elevator stopped on the 20th floor, and 3 men in expensive suits stepped in. I recognized them immediately: Marcus Wellington, the senior partner, David Shin, head of mergers, and Robert Hayes, the firm's golden boy associate who everyone said was destined for partnership. They didn't see me. To them, I was just part of the elevator's interior, no more noticeable than the brushed steel walls or the soft jazz playing overhead. That's when they started talking. "The Henderson acquisition is going to make us rich," Marcus said, loosening his tie. $12 million in fees, and that's just the beginning. "What about the environmental violations?" David asked, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper. "The EPA documentation shows clear contamination issues." Marcus laughed, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. "That's Henderson's problem now. We buried those reports so deep, they'll never surface. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll have our money and Henderson will be someone else's headache." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Isn't that? I mean, aren't we supposed to disclose material information like that?" "Listen, kid," Marcus said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "You want to make partner, you learn to see the gray areas. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to serve your client's best interests. That's what separates the big players from the small-time lawyers." The elevator reached the 25th floor, and David prepared to get off. But before the doors opened, he glanced in my direction for the first time. His eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something flicker across his face, a moment of awareness that someone had overheard their conversation. But then Marcus spoke again, and his words hit me like a physical blow. "Don't worry about her," he said, nodding in my direction without even looking at me. "She's just an old immigrant who cleans our toilets. Probably doesn't even speak English well enough to understand what we're talking about. Even if she did, who would believe her?" David chuckled, relaxing. "You're right. What's she going to do, report us to the janitors' union?" They all laughed as the elevator doors opened. David stepped out, but not before turning back with a smirk. "Besides, these people come and go. She'll probably be deported or quit to go clean someone else's offices soon enough." The doors closed, leaving me alone with my rage and my cart full of cleaning supplies. My hands were shaking as I gripped the handle. For 8 years, I had accepted their dismissal, their casual racism, their assumption that my worth could be measured by the color of my uniform and the heaviness of my accent. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed that because I cleaned their offices, I was ignorant. They assumed that because I spoke with an accent, I was uneducated. They assumed that because I was a 58-year-old immigrant woman pushing a cleaning cart, I was powerless. They had no idea who I really was. The elevator reached the 35th floor, and I stepped out into the familiar corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. But everything felt different now. The same marble floors I had mopped 1,000 times, the same mahogany walls I had dusted, the same conference rooms where I had emptied wastebaskets full of discarded documents. It all looked different through the lens of what I had just heard. I pushed my cart toward the corner office that belonged to Marcus Wellington, the same man who had just dismissed me as just an old immigrant. His office was a monument to success, leather-bound law books, awards covering one wall, a view that probably cost more per month than most people's salaries. As I began dusting his bookshelf, I noticed something I had seen hundreds of times before but never really paid attention to, a framed photograph of Marcus shaking hands with a man I now realized must be Henderson, the client they had just discussed defrauding. Next to it was another photo of Marcus playing golf with several other men in expensive-looking polo shirts. But it wasn't the photos that caught my attention now. It was the stack of documents on his desk, marked Henderson Industries, Confidential. The same Henderson they had just discussed in the elevator. I looked toward the door, making sure no one was watching, then allowed my eyes to scan the top document. Even upside down, I could make out enough to confirm what I had overheard. Environmental reports, EPA violations, and what looked like a deliberate plan to conceal information that could affect the value of the acquisition. For most people, this would have been just a stack of incomprehensible legal jargon. But I wasn't most people, and that was something Marcus Wellington was about to learn the hard way. You see, before I became invisible, before I became just another immigrant cleaning lady, I had a different life. A life that Marcus and his colleagues couldn't imagine when they looked at me in my simple uniform with my graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. 23 years ago, I was one of the most respected corporate attorneys in São Paulo, Brazil. I specialized in international mergers and acquisitions, environmental law, and corporate fraud. I had handled cases involving some of the largest companies in South America, built a reputation for meticulous research and uncompromising ethics. My office overlooking Avenida Paulista was filled with the same kind of awards that now decorated Marcus Wellington's wall. I drove a BMW, lived in a penthouse apartment, and commanded fees that would make most American lawyers envious. I was Doutora Miriam Santos, and my name alone could open doors or end careers. But life has a way of humbling even the most successful among us. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening in March, 15 years ago. I was working late, preparing for a major case, when I received the phone call that would change everything. My daughter Sophia, my beautiful 28-year-old daughter who was finishing her medical residency, had been killed in a car accident. The grief was overwhelming, but what came next was worse. Sophia had been driving home from the hospital where she worked in one of São Paulo's poorest neighborhoods. She had dedicated her life to serving those who couldn't afford private healthcare, and she had been targeted by criminals who mistakenly thought doctors must be wealthy. The police investigation was a joke. The killers were connected to powerful people, and I quickly learned that even my reputation and connections couldn't guarantee justice for my daughter. The system I had served faithfully for 20 years had failed me when I needed it most. That's when I made the decision to leave everything behind. I sold my practice, liquidated my assets, and used the money to immigrate to the United States. I told myself I was starting over, that I would rebuild my career and find the peace that had been stolen from me. But immigration is a great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you were once the most respected attorney in your country. In your new home, you're just another foreigner with an accent and foreign credentials that no one understands or trusts. The New York State Bar examination required me to complete additional coursework, but more importantly, I discovered that my grief had affected my ability to focus on complex legal concepts. The sharp mind that had once dissected corporate contracts and environmental regulations felt dulled, clouded by loss and trauma. I took the cleaning job at Sterling and Associates as a temporary measure, something to pay the bills while I figured out my next step. But temporary became permanent as months turned into years. The law felt too painful now, too connected to the life I had lost. Cleaning was simple, straightforward, honest work that allowed me to exist without having to engage with the complexities that had once defined my identity. For 8 years, I had been content to be invisible, to let Doutora Miriam Santos remain buried beneath the simple exterior of Miriam the cleaning lady. But Marcus Wellington and his colleagues had just made a critical error. They had awakened something I thought was gone forever. As I continued cleaning his office, I began to see everything with new eyes. The legal documents scattered across his desk, the reference books on his shelf, the case files stacked in his credenza. It was all familiar territory, a language I had once spoken fluently. And I realized something that made my pulse quicken. I still spoke that language. 15 years of grief and 8 years of invisibility hadn't erased the legal mind that had once made me formidable in Brazilian courtrooms. More importantly, I had something that Marcus Wellington and his colleagues couldn't imagine: access. For 8 years, I had moved through their offices like a ghost, privy to conversations, documents, and information that they assumed was safe from prying eyes because, after all, who pays attention to the cleaning lady? But what they didn't realize was that the cleaning lady had been a prosecutor's dream witness all along. I had the education to understand what I was seeing, the experience to recognize illegal behavior when I encountered it, and now, thanks to their casual cruelty and criminal arrogance, I had the motivation to do something about it. I finished cleaning Marcus's office and moved on to the conference room where they held their weekly partners' meetings. As I dusted the long mahogany table, I remembered something from my days practicing law in Brazil. The best prosecutors weren't the ones who made dramatic speeches in courtroom. They were the ones who built cases methodically, piece by piece, document by document, until the truth became undeniable. That's when I made my decision. Marcus Wellington thought I was just an old immigrant who would soon disappear from his life. He was about to learn that some immigrants carry more power in their past than he could ever imagine, and that dismissing someone based on their appearance was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. I began that very night. After finishing my regular cleaning duties, I started staying later, using the access my position provided to photograph documents, record conversations, and compile evidence that would make any prosecutor salivate. The Henderson Industries case was just the beginning. As I dug deeper, using skills I hadn't exercised in years, I discovered that Sterling and Associates was involved in a pattern of fraud that stretched back several years and involved multiple clients. They had turned legal representation into a criminal enterprise, and they had done it while looking right through the one person in their office who had the knowledge and experience to expose them. Each night, I would go home to my small studio apartment in Queens, the same apartment I had been living in for 8 years while dreaming of something better. But now, instead of watching television or reading the Brazilian newspapers online, I spent my evenings organizing evidence, cross-referencing documents, and building what I knew would be an airtight case. It felt good to use my legal mind again, like waking up muscles that had been sleeping for too long. The grief that had clouded my thinking for so many years seemed to lift as I focused on the familiar process of legal investigation. For the first time since Sophia's death, I felt like myself again. But I wasn't just building a case for the prosecutors. I was planning something much more satisfying than a simple criminal referral. Marcus Wellington had called me just an old immigrant, and he was about to learn that this particular immigrant had plans that would turn his world upside down. 3 weeks into my covert investigation, I had compiled enough evidence to destroy Sterling and Associates and send several of its partners to federal prison. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. I wanted to understand the full scope of their criminal enterprise, and I wanted to position myself to benefit from the chaos that would inevitably follow. That's when I made a discovery that changed everything. I was cleaning the conference room late one Thursday evening when I overheard Marcus on a phone call with someone he addressed as Senator. The conversation was brief, but I caught enough to understand that Sterling and Associates' corruption went far beyond fraudulent mergers and acquisitions. They were involved in a network of political corruption that included bribes, campaign finance violations, and what sounded like influence peddling at the highest levels of government. As I pretended to focus on cleaning the coffee machine, I listened to Marcus discuss payments that needed to be restructured and meetings that needed to be off the books. When he mentioned specific amounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through offshore accounts, I realized that I wasn't just dealing with garden-variety corporate fraud. This was a criminal conspiracy that could topple some of the most powerful people in New York, and possibly Washington. And the only witness to most of these conversations was a 58-year-old Brazilian immigrant who everyone assumed was too ignorant to understand what she was hearing. After Marcus finished his call and left the office, I sat alone in that conference room and laughed for the first time in years. Not a bitter laugh, but a laugh of pure anticipation. Because I knew something that Marcus Wellington and his criminal colleagues couldn't imagine: their assumption that I was powerless was about to destroy them. I had spent 15 years grieving my daughter and 8 years accepting invisibility. But sitting in that conference room, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes and their arrogance, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Sophia's death, the thrill of the hunt. Dr. Miriam Santos was back, and she was about to remind some very powerful people that immigrants often carry more than just hopes and dreams to their new country. Sometimes, they carry the skills and knowledge that can reshape the balance of power entirely. But first, I needed to make some phone calls. Because what I was planning would require help from people who understood that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, it's justice perfected. The next morning, I arrived at Sterling and Associates at my usual time, badged in through the service entrance, and began my familiar routine. But everything was different now. As I pushed my cart through those marble corridors, I wasn't just an invisible cleaning lady. I was an undercover prosecutor building the case of a lifetime. And the best part? Marcus Wellington and his colleagues still had no idea that their biggest threat wasn't the FBI, the SEC, or any other alphabet agency they might expect. Their biggest threat was the woman they saw every day but never really noticed, the one they had dismissed as just an old immigrant. They were about to learn that underestimating people based on their appearance, age, or immigration status wasn't just morally wrong. Sometimes, it was literally criminal negligence. The irony was perfect. In their arrogance, they had created the perfect witness against themselves. And this witness was about to make them pay not just for their crimes, but for every dismissive glance, every condescending tone, and especially for that moment in the elevator when they had reduced my worth to nothing more than my willingness to clean their toilets. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I needed to make contact with someone who would believe me, someone who would understand the significance of what I had discovered. And I knew exactly who to call. Agent Sarah Martinez had been with the FBI's white-collar crime division for 12 years, and she specialized in cases involving international financial fraud. More importantly, she was the daughter of Mexican immigrants, which meant she would understand things that other federal agents might not. I had researched her extensively before making contact. She had a reputation for being thorough, ethical, and particularly aggressive when it came to prosecuting powerful people who thought their status made them immune to consequences. She was exactly what I needed. I called her office from a payphone near my apartment, using the Portuguese accent that had marked me as an outsider in so many American settings. But this time, I used that accent strategically. "Agent Martinez," I said when she answered, "my name is Miriam Santos, and I work as a cleaning lady at Sterling and Associates. I have information about criminal activity that I think you would find very interesting." There was a pause. I could almost hear her calculating whether this was worth her time. Finally, she said, "What kind of criminal activity, Mrs. Santos?" "Fraud, money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy," I replied. "Involving millions of dollars and some very important people. But I need to meet with you in person. I have documents and recordings that I think you should see." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Santos, are you calling from Sterling and Associates?" "No, I'm calling from a public phone." "I'm not stupid, Agent Martinez. I know enough to protect myself." Something in my tone must have convinced her, because her voice became more professional. "Can you meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m.? There's a coffee shop called Brennan's on East 47th Street. Do you know where that is?" "I'll find it," I said. "Agent Martinez, one more thing. When we meet, you might be surprised by what I tell you. Please keep an open mind." "I always do, Mrs. Santos. See you tomorrow." I hung up the phone and walked back to my apartment, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a plan coming together. Marcus Wellington thought he was dealing with just an old immigrant, but he was actually dealing with someone who had spent 20 years learning how to destroy people like him. The meeting with Agent Martinez would be the first step in a process that would transform not just my life, but the lives of everyone who had ever dismissed me as insignificant. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one that everyone ignores. And Marcus Wellington was about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. The next afternoon, I arrived at Brennan's coffee shop 30 minutes early. I had dressed carefully for this meeting, not in my cleaning uniform, but in one of the few professional outfits I still owned from my previous life. A navy blue suit that still fit well, low heels, and my hair styled in a way that suggested competence rather than invisibility. When Agent Martinez walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photo on the FBI website. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her late 30s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She looked around the coffee shop with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details. I stood up and waved her over. "Agent Martinez, I'm Miriam Santos." She shook my hand and studied my face with open curiosity. "Mrs. Santos, I have to admit, you're not what I was expecting." "Most people don't expect much from cleaning ladies," I replied, gesturing for her to sit down. "That's actually been quite useful." She ordered coffee and opened a small notebook. "Before we begin, I need to tell you that if you're reporting criminal activity, I'm obligated to investigate. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" "Agent Martinez," I said, looking her directly in the eyes, "I spent 20 years as a corporate attorney in Brazil specializing in fraud and corruption cases. I know exactly what I'm getting myself into." Her pen stopped moving. "You're a lawyer?" I was a lawyer. Now I'm a cleaning lady who happens to have overheard some very interesting conversations and seen some very incriminating documents. I leaned forward. "The question is whether the FBI is interested in taking down one of the most corrupt law firms in Manhattan, along with the politicians and businessmen they've been bribing." Agent Martinez closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Santos, why don't you start from the beginning?" For the next 2 hours, I laid out everything I had discovered. The Henderson Industries fraud was just the appetizer. The main course was a systematic pattern of criminal behavior that included money laundering through offshore accounts, bribes to state and federal officials, deliberate concealment of environmental violations that endangered public health, and a conspiracy that involved some of the most prominent names in New York politics and business. As I spoke, Agent Martinez took detailed notes and asked the kind of probing questions that told me she understood the significance of what I was revealing. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "Mrs. Santos," she finally said, "if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be one of the largest white-collar criminal cases in New York history. But I have to ask, why are you coming to me now? You said you've been working there for 8 years. What changed?" I told her about the elevator incident, about Marcus Wellington's dismissive comment that I was just an old immigrant who probably doesn't even speak English well enough to understand. I told her about the laughter, the assumption that I was too ignorant and powerless to matter. "They're not wrong about one thing," I said. "I am an immigrant. But they made the mistake of assuming that made me ignorant or powerless. What they don't understand is that some of us immigrants left successful careers behind. Some of us know exactly what we're looking at when we see criminal behavior." Agent Martinez smiled for the first time during our conversation. "Mrs. Santos, I think you and I are going to work very well together." Over the next 3 months, I became the FBI's most productive undercover asset. Every day, I would arrive at Sterling and Associates, clean their offices, and document their crimes. Every evening, would meet with Agent Martinez or one of her colleagues to turn over recordings, photographs, and copies of documents that built an increasingly comprehensive picture of corruption. The beauty of the operation was its simplicity. I had been invisible to them for 8 years, and I remained invisible even as I systematically collected evidence that would destroy them. They continued to discuss sensitive matters in front of me, leave incriminating documents on their desks, and hold phone conversations that I could overhear from the next room. Marcus Wellington, in particular, seemed to enjoy talking about his various schemes. He would often conduct sensitive phone calls while I cleaned his office, apparently secure in his belief that the cleaning lady couldn't possibly understand the legal and financial complexities he was discussing. If he had known that the cleaning lady had once argued cases before the Brazilian Supreme Court, he might have been more careful. But it wasn't just about collecting evidence. Agent Martinez and her team were building a comprehensive strategy that would maximize the impact of the case when it went public. They wanted to make sure that everyone involved was caught in the net, from the senior partners at Sterling and Associates to the politicians who had been taking their bribes. More importantly, they wanted to make sure that I would be protected when the case broke. Because once Sterling and Associates realized they had been infiltrated by their own cleaning lady, I would become a very valuable and very vulnerable witness. That's when Agent Martinez proposed something that would change my life forever. "Mrs. Santos," she said during one of our regular meetings, "the Justice Department has a witness protection program, but in your case, I think we can do something better. Are you familiar with the False Claims Act?" I knew the law well. It was the federal whistleblower statute that allowed private citizens to file lawsuits against companies and individuals who defrauded the government. Successful whistleblowers could receive substantial financial rewards, sometimes millions of dollars. Several of Sterling and Associates' clients are government contractors, Agent Martinez continued. The environmental violations you've documented, the fraudulent representations in their merger work, the tax evasion schemes, they all involve federal agencies and federal funds. You could file a CATAM lawsuit and potentially receive a significant portion of whatever the government recovers. The financial implications were staggering, but that wasn't what excited me most. What excited me was the poetic justice of it all. Marcus Wellington had dismissed me as powerless, but the law he had spent his career manipulating was about to make me rich at his expense. "There's something else," Agent Martinez said. "Sterling and Associates is heavily leveraged. When this case goes public, the firm will almost certainly collapse. The building they lease, the assets they've accumulated through their criminal activity, it's all going to be available for pennies on the dollar." I understood immediately what she was suggesting. With the money from the whistleblower lawsuit, I could potentially buy the assets of the firm that had treated me as invisible for 8 years. I could literally own the people who had once owned me. "Agent Martinez," I said, "I think I'm beginning to like the American justice system." The next 6 months were the most exhilarating of my life since before Sophia's death. By day, I continued my role as the invisible cleaning lady, watching Marcus Wellington and his colleagues conduct business as usual, completely unaware that every conversation, every document, every careless admission was building the case that would destroy them. By night, I worked with Agent Martinez and a team of federal prosecutors to prepare for the coordinated takedown that would announce to the world that Sterling and Associates had been operating as a criminal enterprise for years. But the most satisfying part was the gradual transformation I felt within myself. For 15 years, I had been running from my identity as Datora Miriam Santos, the successful attorney who had lost everything that mattered. For 8 years, I had hidden behind the persona of Miriam the cleaning lady, the invisible immigrant who posed no threat to anyone. But now, I was becoming something new, a fusion of both identities that was more powerful than either one alone. I had the legal expertise of my former self and the street wisdom of my current self. I had the education of the privileged and the insights of the invisible. Most importantly, I had a purpose that gave meaning to all the pain and loss I had endured. I was going to use my unique position to strike a blow against the kind of casual cruelty and institutional corruption that made people like Marcus Wellington think they were untouchable. The morning of the raid, I arrived at Sterling and Associates at my usual time. Agent Martinez had warned me that federal agents would be arriving around 9 a.m., and that I should stay in the service areas until the initial chaos subsided. But I couldn't resist positioning myself where I could see Marcus Wellington's face when the FBI knocked on his door. I was cleaning the conference room adjacent to his office when I heard the first knock. Through the glass partition, I could see Marcus at his desk, probably reviewing documents for his morning meetings. He looked up with annoyance when the knock interrupted his routine. "Come in," he called out, probably expecting his secretary or one of the junior associates. Instead, Agent Martinez walked through his door, followed by 6 other federal agents and a prosecutor I recognized from our planning meetings. "Marcus Wellington," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls, "I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. We have a warrant to search these premises and arrest several individuals in connection with a federal investigation into fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." The look on Marcus's face was everything I had imagined it would be. Confusion, fear, and then a growing realization that his world was collapsing around him. "This is ridiculous," he stammered, standing up from his desk. "I demand to see the warrant. I demand to call my attorney." "You'll have plenty of time for lawyers, Mr. Wellington," Agent Martinez replied, signaling to one of her colleagues to begin searching his office. "Right now, you need to understand that you're under arrest." As they read him his rights, I continued dusting the conference table, just another piece of invisible furniture in a room where someone's life was being destroyed. But this time, the destruction felt like justice. Word of the arrest spread through the office within minutes. Partners were led away in handcuffs, documents were seized by the box load, and employees stood around in shocked clusters, whispering about what would happen to their jobs. Several of the junior associates and support staff looked lost, like children whose parents had suddenly abandoned them. They had believed they were working for one of the most prestigious law firms in Manhattan. Now they were discovering they had been employees of a criminal organization. But I noticed something else as the chaos unfolded around me. For the first time in 8 years, people were looking at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. Because somehow, word had spread that the cleaning lady had played a role in bringing down Sterling and Associates. David Chen, the mergers and acquisitions partner who had laughed about my inability to understand English, was led past the conference room in handcuffs. As he passed, his eyes met mine through the glass partition. I saw recognition there, and fear, and something else, the dawning realization that the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant had just destroyed his life. I continued cleaning, but I allowed myself a small smile. Because David Chen was beginning to understand something that Marcus Wellington was also learning in his corner office. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never bothered to notice. The raids made front-page news in every major newspaper in New York. Sterling and Associates, prestigious law firm or criminal enterprise, read the headline in the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal focused on the financial implications. Major law firm collapse could cost investors millions. The Daily News went with the human interest angle. Cleaning lady helps FBI take down corrupt lawyers. But none of the news coverage captured the full scope of what had happened. The public knew that Sterling and Associates had been exposed as a criminal organization, and they knew that a whistleblower had provided crucial evidence. What they didn't know was that the whistleblower was about to become very, very wealthy. The False Claims Act lawsuit I filed through my attorneys resulted in a settlement of $47 million, of which I received $15 million as the whistleblower's reward. The money was more than I had ever dreamed of having, even in my most successful days as an attorney in Brazil. But money was just the beginning. As Agent Martinez had predicted, Sterling and Associates collapsed within weeks of the arrests. The firm's assets were seized by the federal government and scheduled for auction to help compensate the victims of their fraud. Using a portion of my whistleblower reward and financing arranged through contacts Agent Martinez helped me establish, I acquired the lease on the Sterling and Associates building, along with most of their office furniture, law library, and technology systems. 6 months after Marcus Wellington had dismissed me as just an old immigrant, I owned his former office, sat in his former chair, and looked out through his former windows at the Manhattan skyline he had once believed belonged to him. But I didn't stop there. Using the rest of my whistleblower money and additional investors I recruited through legal contacts I had maintained from my days in Brazil, I established Santos and Associates, a law firm specializing in corporate whistleblower cases and immigrant rights. My first hire was Sofia Martinez, Agent Martinez's younger sister, who had just graduated from law school and shared her sister's passion for justice. My second hire was Maria Rodriguez, a brilliant attorney who had been working as a paralegal because her Venezuelan law degree wasn't recognized in New York. Within a year, Santos and Associates had grown to 12 attorneys, most of them immigrants whose talents had been overlooked by traditional law firms. We specialized in representing the invisible, the dismissed, the underestimated, people like the woman I had been just 2 years earlier. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when several former Sterling and Associates clients approached us for representation in their lawsuits against their former attorneys. They were seeking damages for the fraud and malpractice that had cost them millions of dollars, and they wanted Santos and Associates to handle their cases. Among those clients was Henderson Industries, the company whose environmental violations Marcus Wellington had conspired to conceal. They were facing massive cleanup costs and regulatory penalties, and they wanted to recover those expenses from Sterling and Associates' malpractice insurance and the personal assets of the partners who had betrayed them. I accepted their case, of course. There was a beautiful symmetry in using the very fraud that Marcus Wellington had discussed so casually in that elevator to fund the legal practice that would ensure he never worked as an attorney again. 2 years after that fateful morning when Marcus Wellington, David Chen, and Robert Hayes had dismissed me as just an old immigrant in their elevator, I was sitting in the corner office that had once belonged to Marcus, preparing for a deposition in the Henderson Industries malpractice case. My secretary knocked and entered. "Ms. Santos, your 10 o'clock appointment is here." "Thank you, Patricia. Please send him in." The man who walked through my door was barely recognizable as the confident senior partner who had once ruled over Sterling and Associates. Marcus Wellington had aged years in the past 24 months. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing, his confident swagger had become a nervous shuffle, and his dismissive arrogance had been replaced by the desperate humility of someone whose world had collapsed completely. He had requested this meeting through his attorney, claiming he had information that might be useful in our representation of Henderson Industries. What he really wanted, I suspected, was to ask for mercy. "Mr. Wellington," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where powerful clients had once sat to discuss million-dollar deals with him. "Please, have a seat." He sat down and looked around the office that had once been his domain. "You've redecorated," he said, trying to maintain some dignity. "I've made some changes," I agreed. "I find that the office works better when it's designed to serve justice rather than greed." He winced at that, but pressed on. "Ms. Santos, I want you to know that I never intended, that is, I never meant to." "To what, Mr. Wellington?" "To commit fraud? To endanger public health? To bribe government officials?" I leaned forward. "Or did you mean you never intended to be so dismissive of the cleaning lady who was listening to every word you said?" His face flushed red. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things." "Yes, you were," I said simply. "You were wrong to assume that someone's worth could be measured by their job title or their immigration status. You were wrong to believe that being invisible made someone powerless. And you were spectacularly wrong to underestimate what this particular immigrant was capable of accomplishing." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What do you want from me, Ms. Santos?" "I want you to understand something, Mr. Wellington. When you called me just an old immigrant in that elevator, you weren't just insulting me. You were insulting every person who has ever been dismissed because of their accent, their age, or their circumstances. You were perpetuating the kind of casual cruelty that makes people invisible in their own lives." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking Central Park, the same view he had enjoyed for so many years while building his criminal empire. "But here's what you failed to understand," I continued, not turning around to face him. "Immigrants don't come to this country empty-handed. We bring our histories, our education, our experiences, our skills. Some of us bring law degrees and 20 years of courtroom experience. Some of us bring medical training, engineering expertise, or business acumen that could transform entire industries." I turned back to face him. "What we don't bring is the luxury of being underestimated forever. Eventually, someone like you makes the mistake of dismissing us so completely that we have no choice but to remind you who we really are." Marcus Wellington sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the reality of his situation. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" "Now?" I returned to my desk and sat down, looking at him across the mahogany surface where he had once planned criminal conspiracies. "Now you face the consequences of your choices. The federal prosecutors are seeking a 15-year prison sentence. The civil lawsuits will likely consume whatever assets you have left. Your law license has been permanently revoked." I paused, letting the full weight of his situation settle over him. "As for Henderson Industries, they're seeking $47 million in damages from you personally, plus punitive damages that could triple that amount. They have a very good attorney representing them, someone who understands corporate fraud from both sides of the courtroom." His shoulders sagged as the mathematical reality of his situation became clear. Even if he managed to avoid the maximum prison sentence, he would never recover financially from the civil judgments against him. "But there is one thing you can do," I said, opening a file folder on my desk. You can help ensure that justice is served completely. There are still some aspects of your criminal enterprise that the government hasn't fully unraveled. Politicians who took your bribes but haven't been charged yet. Business partners who participated in your schemes but managed to avoid prosecution. I slid a document across the desk to him. Full cooperation with ongoing investigations. Complete disclosure of every crime you committed and every person who helped you commit them. In exchange, the prosecutors might consider a reduced sentence. He picked up the document with shaking hands and scanned its contents. You want me to confess to everything? To implicate everyone? I want you to tell the truth, Mr. Wellington. It's a novel concept, I know, but I think you'll find it liberating after so many years of lies and corruption. He set the document down and looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time since I had known him. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I had excellent teachers, I replied. 20 years of corporate law practice taught me how to build airtight cases. 8 years of being invisible in your office taught me how to see everything without being noticed. And 15 years of grief taught me that patience can be more powerful than revenge. I stood up again, this time moving toward the door to signal that our meeting was ending. You have 48 hours to decide whether you want to cooperate, Mr. Wellington. After that, the offer is withdrawn and you face the full consequences of your choices alone. He stood up slowly, looking around the office one final time. Miss Santos, he said as he reached the door, I want you to know that I understand now. I understand what I cost you, what I cost all the people I dismissed over the years. Do you? I asked. Do you understand that every time you looked through me, every time you talked about me like I wasn't there, every time you reduced my worth to my willingness to clean your toilets, you were diminishing not just me, but the very idea that all people have inherent dignity? He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I understand. Good, I said. Because understanding is the first step toward redemption. The second step is making amends. The third step is ensuring that no one else suffers the way your victims have suffered. After he left, I sat alone in my office for several minutes, processing the surreal nature of what had just occurred. 2 years ago, Marcus Wellington had been one of the most powerful attorneys in Manhattan, and I had been an invisible cleaning lady he wouldn't have noticed if I had disappeared entirely. Now our positions were completely reversed, but more importantly, the reversal meant something beyond personal satisfaction. Every immigrant who had been dismissed, every older worker who had been discarded, every person who had been made invisible by prejudice and assumption, they all had a victory in this moment. But my story doesn't end with Marcus Wellington's downfall, because real change isn't just about individual justice. It's about systemic transformation. 6 months after that meeting, Santos and Associates had grown to 18 attorneys and had offices in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. We were handling whistleblower cases, immigration rights litigation, and civil rights lawsuits that were changing how corporations and government agencies treated vulnerable populations. More importantly, we were changing who got to practice law in New York. Half of our attorneys were immigrants whose foreign credentials had been overlooked by traditional firms. A third were over 50, experienced lawyers who had been pushed out of corporate practice because of age discrimination. Several were women of color who had been tokenized or marginalized in their previous positions. What we had created wasn't just a law firm, it was a proof of concept. We were demonstrating that the people who had been deemed unemployable by established institutions could outperform those institutions when given the opportunity. Our success attracted attention from legal publications, business journals, and eventually, law schools. I was invited to give lectures about corporate fraud, whistleblower protection, and the hidden talents that exist within immigrant communities. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. I was in my office late one evening, reviewing documents for a complex whistleblower case, when Patricia knocked on my door. Miss Santos, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Who is it? She says her name is Elena Volkov, and she works as a night cleaner in the Goldman Sachs building. I looked up from my documents, immediately intrigued. Send her in, Patricia. The woman who entered my office was probably in her early 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that showed the signs of hard physical work. She was wearing a simple blouse and skirt, and she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to make herself small in a world that preferred not to see her. "Miss Santos," she said in accented English, "my name is Elena Volkov. I am from Ukraine, and I work cleaning offices at Goldman Sachs." I gestured for her to sit down. "Please, Ms. Volkov, make yourself comfortable. How can I help you?" She sat on the edge of the chair, clearly nervous but determined. "I read about you in newspaper. About how you were cleaning lady who became lawyer who owned the people who treated you badly." I nodded. "That's essentially what happened, yes. I have been in America for 12 years, she continued, her accent becoming more pronounced as her emotions intensified. "In Ukraine, I was mathematics professor at university. I taught advanced calculus, number theory, complex analysis. But here, nobody cares about Ukrainian mathematics degree." I could see where this was heading, and I felt the familiar flutter of excitement that came with recognizing an opportunity for justice. "What have you observed at Goldman Sachs, Ms. Volkov?" Her eyes lit up with the same intelligence I had seen in my own mirror 2 years earlier. "They think I don't understand numbers because I clean their offices. But Ms. Santos, I understand numbers better than most of them do." She opened a small notebook and placed it on my desk. "For 3 years, I have been watching them manipulate trading algorithms. I have been listening to phone calls about insider trading. I have been seeing documents about market manipulation that I know violates federal securities law." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "Ms. Volkov, are you telling me that you've been documenting securities fraud at Goldman Sachs?" "I am telling you that these people discuss criminal activity in front of me because they think Ukrainian cleaning lady is too stupid to understand what they are saying." She paused, and I saw a familiar fire in her eyes. "But mathematician who spent 30 years studying complex systems understands financial fraud very, very well." I opened her notebook and began scanning the contents. What I saw there made my breath catch. Elena Volkov hadn't just been overhearing random conversations, she had been conducting a sophisticated mathematical analysis of trading patterns, documenting statistical anomalies that suggested systematic market manipulation. "Ms. Volkov," I said, looking up at her with growing admiration, "how would you feel about changing careers again?" "Because I think Santos and Associates just found its next partner." The smile that spread across her face was identical to the one I had felt when Agent Martinez first explained the False Claims Act to me. It was the smile of someone who had been invisible for too long and was about to remind the world that dismissing people based on their circumstances was a very expensive mistake. "Ms. Santos," she said, "I think that would be very satisfying. Over the next 6 months, Elena Volkov and I worked together to build what would become the largest securities fraud case in Wall Street history." Her mathematical expertise combined with my legal experience created an unstoppable force that ultimately resulted in a $200 million settlement with Goldman Sachs. Elena's share of the whistleblower reward was $37 million, which she used to establish the Volkov Foundation for Immigrant Professional Development. The foundation provides resources to help immigrants with advanced degrees navigate the complex process of credential recognition and career transition in the United States. But more than the money, more than the professional success, what Elena and I had accomplished together was proof of a simple but revolutionary concept. The people that society overlooks often possess the exact skills needed to hold powerful institutions accountable. We weren't just 2 middle-aged immigrant women who had gotten lucky. We were representatives of a vast untapped resource, millions of highly educated, experienced professionals whose talents were being wasted because of prejudice, bureaucracy, and the assumption that foreign credentials somehow made a person less capable. Santos and Associates became a magnet for these overlooked talents. Engineers working as security guards, doctors driving taxis, professors cleaning offices, they all found their way to our door, drawn by the story of the cleaning lady who had become a law firm owner and the mathematics professor who had exposed Wall Street corruption. Each of them brought not just their professional skills, but their unique perspectives on the industries where they had been invisible. A former Romanian engineer working as a maintenance supervisor at a chemical plant documented environmental violations. A former Indian physician working as a medical translator uncovered insurance fraud at a major hospital system. A former Chinese economics professor working as a restaurant dishwasher identified a complex money laundering operation. What we discovered was that making people invisible didn't make their problems disappear, it just made those problems harder to see. But invisible people see everything, and when they're finally empowered to speak, they have stories that can shake the foundations of even the most powerful institutions. 5 years after Marcus Wellington had dismissed me as just an old immigrant, Santos and Associates had grown into one of the most feared law firms on the East Coast. We specialized in cases that other firms couldn't or wouldn't take: complex whistleblower lawsuits, international fraud investigations, and civil rights litigation that required understanding multiple legal systems and cultural contexts. Our success rate was extraordinary, partly because we had access to sources of information that traditional law firms never considered. When you employ attorneys who had been invisible in the industries they now investigated, you have insights that money can't buy and connections that privilege can't access. But perhaps more importantly, we had something that our opponents consistently underestimated: motivation. Every attorney at Santos and Associates had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated at some point in their career. We understood intimately what it felt like to be treated as if our worth could be measured by external circumstances rather than internal capabilities. That understanding made us formidable advocates for our clients, because we knew that justice delayed or denied to one invisible person threatened the dignity of all invisible people. The morning of my 60th birthday, I sat in my office reviewing the files of our current cases. 47 active whistleblower investigations. 63 civil rights lawsuits. 12 international fraud cases that spanned 3 continents. Each file represented not just legal work, but a story of someone who had been dismissed as irrelevant and was fighting to prove their worth. Patricia knocked on my door. "Ms. Santos, there's a reporter here from the New York Times. She's writing a story about immigrant entrepreneurs and wants to interview you about the firm's success." I had given dozens of interviews over the past few years, but I still felt a thrill of satisfaction when journalists wanted to understand how Santos and Associates had become so successful. Because each interview was an opportunity to tell the world something they needed to hear: the people you overlook might be the most dangerous people to overlook. "Send her in, Patricia." The reporter was a young woman, probably in her early 30s, with the eager energy of someone building a career in competitive journalism. She introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh and explained that her editor was interested in success stories within immigrant communities. "Ms. Santos," she began after we had settled into our chairs, "your story is remarkable. From cleaning lady to law firm owner in just 5 years. What would you say is the key to your success?" I had answered this question many times, but I always tried to give a thoughtful response because the answer mattered more than most people realized. "The key to my success," I said, "was not my education, my experience, or my determination, although all of those things were important. The key to my success was that powerful people made the mistake of believing that dismissing me made me powerless." Jennifer scribbled notes quickly. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" "When someone treats you as invisible, they reveal their vulnerabilities to you without realizing it. They discuss sensitive information in front of you. They leave incriminating documents where you can see them. They behave in ways they would never behave if they thought you mattered." I paused, choosing my words carefully. What Marcus Wellington and his colleagues didn't understand was that being invisible gave me access to information that the FBI couldn't have obtained through traditional investigation methods. They created the perfect undercover agent and never realized what they had done. "So you're saying that their prejudice actually enabled your success?" "I'm saying that prejudice creates blind spots, and blind spots create opportunities for the people who are being overlooked." Marcus Wellington could have been more careful with his criminal activity, but he wasn't careful because he didn't think the cleaning lady was capable of understanding or acting on what she observed. Jennifer looked up from her notes. "What advice would you give to other immigrants who feel invisible in their workplaces?" "I would tell them that being invisible is not the same as being powerless," I replied. "Sometimes the most powerful position in the room is the one that everyone ignores. Pay attention to what you see and hear. Document what you observe. And remember that your foreign education, your different perspective, your unique experiences, these are not weaknesses. They are advantages that your American-born colleagues don't possess." I leaned forward, warming to a theme I had discussed many times but never tired of exploring. I would also tell them that America is supposed to be a country where talent and hard work are rewarded regardless of where you come from. When that promise is broken, when people are dismissed because of their accents or their circumstances, it creates an injustice that demands correction. And you see your law firm as a form of justice? I see my law firm as proof that the people America overlooks are often the people America needs most. We have attorneys from 15 different countries speaking 12 different languages. We have expertise in legal systems, business practices, and cultural contexts that traditional American law firms can't match. I gestured toward the window overlooking Manhattan. This city is full of former professors driving taxis, former engineers working in restaurants, former doctors cleaning offices. That's not just a waste of human potential, it's a strategic disadvantage for American businesses and institutions that could benefit from that expertise. Jennifer finished writing and looked up. Ms. Santos, what do you hope your legacy will be? That question always made me think of Sophia, my daughter whose death had set me on the path that led to this moment. What would she think of what I had accomplished? Would she be proud that her mother had transformed grief and invisibility into purpose and power? I hope my legacy will be that I helped change how America sees and treats immigrants, I said finally. Not just the young, highly educated immigrants who arrive speaking perfect English and ready to assimilate immediately. I want to change how we see the older immigrants, the ones with accents, the ones whose credentials don't translate easily. I paused, thinking of Elena Volkov and all the other invisible professionals we had helped transform their lives. I want people to understand that when you dismiss someone because of their age, their accent, or their current circumstances, you might be dismissing exactly the person who could solve your biggest problems or expose your worst vulnerabilities. After Jennifer left, I sat alone in my office thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From Doutora Miriam Santos in Sao Paulo to invisible cleaning lady to law firm owner, it had been a path I never could have imagined when I first arrived in America 15 years ago. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the journey was how it had revealed something about America that I hadn't understood before. This country was full of invisible people with extraordinary talents, waiting for someone to recognize their worth. Immigrants, older workers, people whose circumstances had forced them into positions that didn't reflect their capabilities. They represented a vast untapped resource. Santos and Associates had succeeded not despite hiring these overlooked individuals, but because of it. Our unique perspectives, our diverse experiences, our understanding of what it meant to be invisible, these qualities made us more effective advocates than we ever could have been if we had followed traditional career paths. Looking back on that morning in the elevator when Marcus Wellington had dismissed me as just an old immigrant, I realized that he had been partially right. I was an immigrant, and I was getting older. But what he had failed to understand was that being an immigrant had given me skills and perspectives that native-born Americans didn't possess. And being older had given me patience, wisdom, and resilience that younger people often lacked. Most importantly, being dismissed as powerless had taught me how to recognize and leverage the power that comes from being underestimated. When people don't see you as a threat, you can accomplish things that would be impossible if they were paying attention. The irony was perfect. Marcus Wellington's prejudice had created the conditions for his own downfall. His assumption that immigrants were ignorant had blinded him to the fact that this particular immigrant understood corporate fraud better than he did. His belief that older women were irrelevant had prevented him from recognizing that this older woman was documenting his crimes. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I walked past the framed newspaper articles that lined the hallway leading to the elevator. Cleaning lady becomes millionaire whistleblower. Immigrant attorney takes down Wall Street giants. How invisible workers are reshaping American justice. Each headline told a story of transformation, but they also told a deeper story about the hidden potential that exists in every community, in every workplace, in every person who has been dismissed as irrelevant. Standing in the elevator, the same elevator where Marcus Wellington had made his fatal mistake 5 years earlier, I thought about all the invisible people who were still out there, still being overlooked, still being underestimated. They were the hotel housekeepers overhearing corporate executives discuss insider trading. The night janitors witnessing environmental violations at manufacturing plants. The cafeteria workers observing government officials taking bribes over lunch. They were the former professors, the former doctors, the former engineers who had been reduced to service work but had never lost their ability to recognize systemic problems and solutions. Most importantly, they were the next generation of advocates who would carry forward the work that Elena Volkov and I had begun. Because once you prove that invisible people can hold powerful institutions accountable, you inspire other invisible people to step forward and demand the recognition they deserve. The elevator reached the ground floor, and I walked through the marble lobby that had once intimidated me when I arrived each morning to clean other people's offices. Now it was my lobby, in my building, part of the law firm that bore my name and reflected my values. But as I pushed through the revolving door onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, I wasn't thinking about my success or my wealth or my transformation from invisible cleaning lady to powerful attorney. I was thinking about tomorrow morning, when dozens of invisible people would arrive at offices throughout the city, carrying with them the skills, knowledge, and perspectives that could change everything, if only someone would pay attention. Because the most important lesson of my story isn't that one immigrant woman managed to turn the tables on the people who dismissed her. The most important lesson is that every community, every workplace, every institution is surrounded by invisible people whose talents and insights could transform how business is conducted, how justice is served, and how success is measured. Marcus Wellington called me just an old immigrant, and in one sense, he was right. I was just one person, one story, one example of what happens when assumptions about worth and capability are proven catastrophically wrong. But I was also something else, proof that in America, being invisible doesn't have to mean being powerless. Sometimes, it just means waiting for the right moment to remind the world that the most dangerous people to underestimate are the ones you never bothered to notice in the first place. And if you're reading this story, if you recognize yourself as one of the invisible people in your workplace or community, remember what I learned during those 8 years of cleaning offices and overhearing secrets. Your time will come. Your talents will be recognized. Your worth will be acknowledged. You just have to be patient enough to build your case, smart enough to document what you observe, and brave enough to step forward when the moment is right. Because sometimes, the most powerful revenge is not revenge at all. Sometimes, it's simply becoming everything that the people who dismissed you never imagined you could be. The next morning, as I sat in the office that once belonged to Marcus Wellington, preparing for another day of representing the invisible and the overlooked, I remembered something Sophia used to say when she was working with underserved patients at the public hospital in Sao Paulo. Mama, she would tell me, the most important patients are often the ones that everyone else stops seeing. They're the ones who need advocates the most, because they've learned not to advocate for themselves. Sophia had been talking about medical care, but her words applied just as well to legal representation, corporate accountability, and social justice. The people who need advocates the most are often the ones who have been taught to remain invisible. At Santos and Associates, we specialized in making the invisible visible, in giving voice to the voiceless, and in proving that the people society overlooks often possess exactly the skills and knowledge needed to hold powerful institutions accountable. Marcus Wellington had called me just an old immigrant because he couldn't imagine that an immigrant cleaning lady could possess the education, experience, and determination necessary to destroy his criminal empire. He was wrong about that, just as he was wrong about so many other things. But his mistake became my opportunity, and my opportunity became a platform for demonstrating that America's greatest untapped resource isn't oil or technology or natural resources. It's the millions of invisible people whose talents are being wasted because of prejudice, assumption, and the comfortable belief that current circumstances reflect permanent capabilities. Today, Santos and Associates continues to grow, continues to win cases, and continues to prove that the most effective advocates are often the ones who understand what it means to be dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated. We are living proof that when you call someone just an old immigrant, you might be talking to the person who will own you tomorrow. And if you're one of the invisible people reading this story, remember, your moment is coming. Your talents matter. Your worth is not determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what Marcus Wellington never expected me to do: prove him wrong.